This is part 2 of the Get User Input tutorial, and it's going to use the exact same file as macro class 5, where I showed you how to get user input using the message box pop-up window. But here I'm going to show you how to do it using the user input box window. So that will allow the user to actually type some values in, numbers, text, or even select cells within the worksheet and have that data sent through the pop-up window back into the macro. So you could think of this as kind of an expanded version of the message box. Before we start, check the video description and click the link to TeachExcel so you can download the files for the tutorial and follow along. And make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials. Let's go to the VBA window, Alt F11, and here you're already going to see a module with the message box code in it from the previous tutorial. I'm going to leave that in here since basically they do the same thing. This gets input one way and the user input will get it another way. So let's go down here and create a new sub. Just call it Get User Input. We're going to start out very simple here, like in the message box example, and build on that. Here, instead of message box, we want to type input box. Hit a space. We're going to see all the options that we have here. You can even change the position of the box, but I want to keep it very simple for now. So let's just type, hi there, close the quotation marks, run the macro. And you'll see that it kind of looks like a message box, but we have this nice, awesome little input area down here. So you can see hi there up here, and we have OK and cancel. And type stuff here. Also notice that with this message box, you still cannot select outside of the box in its current form. At the end of the tutorial, I'll show you a more advanced version of this message box that will allow you to do that. All right, so let's just title this Basic Useless Version. And this is useless because we aren't doing anything with the input. We cannot yet get to the input. Now notice for the input box, it only had the OK and the cancel button. And this one doesn't allow you to choose a bunch of different buttons because this input box, it's made solely for the purpose of soliciting input. So you either get the input or you don't get the input. So we're not going to have a bunch of options to choose for different buttons. So to get the input, we should put that input into a variable. Let's just call it input value and then equals input box, and let's just keep it simple. Hi there. Notice when I do this once again, I can't use the same format as I had up here. So I need to go ahead and put parentheses around it. That can be kind of confusing. It can be easy if you're using one format for a very long time and then you have to actually get the value. It's going to happen more with message boxes, but to forget to put the parentheses around it. But if you see that error and you're trying to put it into a variable, just put parentheses around it and it should fix it. Now I'm going to go ahead and output the input value so we can see it. Run the macro. My input. Hit OK. And my input. So this right here, being output in the message box, it was sent into the macro. And then we did something with it. We put it in a message box to show ourselves. Now what happens if I click cancel? So let's run this guy again. My input, man. Cancel. It returns nothing. So we don't really have to check which button was clicked. We just have to check if a value was returned. Now there are more complex ways to be very certain if the user clicked cancel or input an empty string, but that's a little bit beyond this tutorial. And the reason that you don't really need to know that is because since this input, as I mentioned earlier, its goal is to get something from the user. So if you get nothing from the user, if you get a blank, that's exactly the same as hitting cancel or X. It's basically just yes or no. You got something, you didn't get something. So I hit escape there, which is the same as cancel. So we got nothing. Now I want to show you the standard way. Well, let's go ahead and comment this. So display value input by user. And I will comment that out, leave it in, and put a comment up here, get user input. All right, now I'm going to show you the standard way to check if a user input nothing or hit the cancel button. It's going to seem a little bit weird at first, but this is the typical way that it's done in this case. So if statement, like before, if input value, and you can do equals, VB null string. So VB null string is what we want to do. Seems kind of confusing. Basically, we're checking if nothing was sent back. Nothing submitted or cancel button pressed. Do a little message box. No input. And actually what we could do, let's move this over here, make it an else. So else, I'll remove that. If we are here, user submitted a value. So if they didn't input anything or hit the cancel button, we're going to output this message box here, or we're going to output, if they did input something, what they input. So stuff here, okie dokie, stuff here. Stuff here, but they hit the cancel button, no input. Or just leave it as no input, cancel, no input. Now let's test one more condition. You hit OK with nothing in there, no input. So you can see it's very binary. You got input, you didn't get input. It's kind of funny that though this, when you see the actual pop-up window in Excel, seems like a more complex thing than the message box, there are fewer options. You're really not going to do as much with the input box as you do with the message box. But let's go ahead and fill out at least the title up here. So go back to the input box, type a comma, and the next option is for title. And I'm just going to make it my title, not feeling very creative. And just like with the message box, we got a nice little title, my title. Obviously down here you'd want to put something descriptive. So you would want to put something that solicits the correct feedback from the user. So please enter your name, or please enter the order number. So if you're making a macro that's going to search through a lot of spreadsheets, you could do that. Or which worksheet do you want to, or through which worksheet do you want to search? So you want to put here, or tell the user here what you want to get down here in the input. Now, once you've got the input from the user, so let's say you made it down to here, the very next step is a validation. And this is one of the most annoying things to have to do. Wouldn't it be nice if everyone could just enter exactly what they needed to do? So input validation, make sure the user input the correct values. So if you want them to input a number, you need to make sure it's a number. Text, text. Basically, you want to make sure that they input what they were supposed to input. And this can take a lot of space. It can be as complex as you need it to be, and it can be very annoying to check for every condition. So I'm not going to cover that in this tutorial, but just know that this is where you would do that. But the next thing that I do want to cover is I want to cover another type of user input box that allows for validation. So it has built-in validation, and it's actually pretty cool. So let's go ahead and make a third macro here. Sub get user input validation. Let's call it that. Actually, before I go on to that example, there was one more thing I want to show you, kind of a neat little argument for the input box. If you hit a comma after the title argument, you can input a default value. Let's call it default value that's going to appear in the input. So down here you can see already highlighted in blue, default value. Now it doesn't have the same features as what we've come to expect from the internet and web forms, where when you click it, it automatically deletes the text. So the text is still going to be there. The user still has to delete it or overwrite it. And as a result, you may not want to put a default value in there, because trust me, when you deal with user input, you're going to get a lot of, if the default value here is default value, you're going to get a lot of people who've just input default value. So it is an option. You can input the default value, whatever you want there, but I'm going to remove it from this example because I just don't think it's very good practice to do that. So just be descriptive for what the user should input where I have put hi there. All right, let's go back to the user input with a little bit of validation. Now let's go ahead and make the variable input value once again. And this time, instead of just typing input box, we want to type application dot input box. Then open parentheses, and it's going to look very similar to the other one. We've got prompt, title, default, left top. That looks a little different than the other one. Help file, help context ID, but then at the very end, we have type. And that is the amazing thing that is going to allow you to limit the data that the user can input. This is data validation on the input box. That's what it is. So let's say, please enter a number. Title, enter a number. Now, there are a couple different ways to do what I'm about to do. And I've thought about which is going to be the least confusing when it's first introduced. So I'm going to do the comma method, which is we're going to skip over these arguments to get to the very last argument. So if I type comma, you can see we're in the default argument right now. Another comma takes us to the left, another one to the top, then to the help file, then to the help context ID, and now one more, and we're finally in the type argument. In a moment, I'll show you perhaps a better but more confusing way, or more confusing if you're not used to it, way to do that. So for the type, let's put 1. Then we close the parentheses, go to the next line. And now let's go see how this works. We don't need to output the input value just yet. Let's run it. So here it didn't take us back to the spreadsheet. I'll cancel that and redo that. So let's go back to the spreadsheet and run it. Alt F11, Alt F8, get user input validation, run. And you notice that this window actually looks different from the other user input. So you could say it does look a little bit nicer perhaps. Now here we have, please enter a number. Let's say no, I don't want to enter a number. Hit OK. Number is not valid. How beautiful is that? It did the validation for us. Now let's enter a number and see what happens. 2. And it's perfect. It allows us to enter the value. So we don't have to worry about doing that extra step up here of input validation. Now using the application.inputBox version of the input box is nice for very simple validation, like for the numbers, but it can get a bit more complex when you want to, let's say, validate more complex features such as formulas or ranges, and then use those values within the macro. So you do need to be aware it's more flexible, but it can be a bit more complex as well. So what I'm going to do here is to show you one really neat way that you might want to use this, which is to have the user select ranges within the workbook. And then here in the code, I'll make some comments to show you all the options that you could output for this last option here, the type argument. And while I'm at it, let me quickly go ahead and show you another way to make this. So let's comment this out, copy it, and put it down here. So you can see to skip all the arguments, I put a lot of commas in there. But what you can also do is to type the name of the argument. So this first argument here, let's scroll over. I can say prompt colon equal sign. And this is standard for all of the functions in VBA, by the way, not just the input box. You could also do this for the message box if you wanted. So prompt colon equals. Now let's go over here. Title colon equals. And you have to do this for every argument. So if you start for one, you have to do it for all. So notice if I click away, it's going to give me an error, and it says expected named parameter. So you can't just do it for one of them. So now let's go over here, erase all this. All we need now is one single comma, gives us the list of the arguments. We want to do it for the type argument, so that's how you can get the correct spelling if you're not sure. Type colon equals. So this way, we didn't have to have all of those extra little commas. But the first time you see it written like this, type colon equal sign, it can be kind of confusing, especially if you're only ever used to the notation with the formulas and functions within the workbook where you just use commas to separate everything. But you'll notice if I do this now, it should work exactly the same. So I don't want to enter a number. Number is not valid. Enter a number, and it works. And quickly, I'm going to output the input value. And that will kind of round out that example. So we test it one more time. Enter a number. No. Enter a number. And it outputs the number. So I'm going to comment this to examples for getting user input. I will comment this out. Then output the user input, and I will comment this out. All right, now I might move a little bit faster here. Let's go to the very last example where you can select a range, and then we will do something with that range. All right, first things first, we need to create a variable that can hold a range. So let's call it user input range as range. Okie dokie. Technically, I didn't need to do that, but it's nicer to do that when dealing with ranges. Now we need to set this range variable equal to the input. So set user input range equal to, and if the set thing is a bit confusing, don't worry about it. For ranges, you just have to use set in front of the variable name. So set user input range equal to application dot input box. Now what do I want for the prompt? Let's say select a cell. And for the type, we want to make it 8. And 8 means that the user needs to select a range. So if I run this right now, you'll see that I can select a cell in the worksheet and it automatically fills in with the cell reference here. So that's a really neat little feature that you've got here that you don't have in the regular input box, the ability to interact with values out here. Now I can't enter value into the cell, so once I start typing it goes over here. I can just select the cells. Now if I hit OK, it works. If I did anything other than a cell reference, error. Now I got a little error here, but I'll cover that in a moment. It's not a big deal, and there's an easy way to get around it. So for now, let's just hit end and move on. And now let's make something happen with that range. So let's just say user input range dot value equals high. Alt F11, Alt F8, run the macro, select the cell, enter, OK. And there we go, the value high in that cell. And that's just one example of how the application input box can be rather helpful, especially when you want to select ranges. All right, now let's fix the error that appears when you don't send this a range. So if I go back to the spreadsheet and I run it and I do not give it a range here, but I don't hit OK, I just hit cancel, we get this error here. And the problem is that this is supposed to get a range and basically it's not getting a range, so it's really confused. There are a lot of different ways to solve this problem, to get around this error. So this isn't the only way, but I'm going to give you a pretty simple, easy way. In very small macros, especially, this is quite easy to do. We can type on error resume next, and I could put that up here. So I could just put that right above this little bit of code if I wanted to, or just at the very top of my macro. And then down here at the end, we could put on error go to 0. And then when I go to run this, cancel, no problem. Now I'm not covering errors in this tutorial, so I'm not going to go more in depth on how you can handle errors, because you can do a lot of really cool, interesting things with them, but it gets confusing really, really quickly. But the one thing I will say that's pretty important if you're going to use the on error resume next is that all this does is it basically just skips the line of code that caused the error. So it doesn't fix anything in the macro. It just sort of ignores it. So what you should do, I'll give you an example, is you still need to check if a range was selected. So we could go down here, just say message box, hi. Now let's go ahead and run the macro. This is going to show you that now I'm going to hit cancel. This is supposed to cause the error, but we've suppressed the error. But this still runs. Now what that shows you, it's a visual representation of the fact that it still goes down each line and runs the code. So you need to have a little bit of validation in here to make sure that the user has actually entered a range, because it's still going to actually run this line, but it's not going to work. So what we could do, I'm going to do it right down here where we have some space, is check if the user input range is actually a range. And one easy way to do this is to check if it is nothing. So just bear with me. If user input range is nothing, then message box no range entered. And if, and let's kill this guy down here. All right, now let's see how this works. Alt F11, Alt F8. Get user input, run, throw the error. No range entered. Now let's make sure it runs correctly normally. Get user input validation, select a cell, hit OK, and it says hi, but we don't get the pop-up box. So I know that I said this was a little bit easier because it validates your input, but you still need to have your own little set of validation. You still need to have checks on your end to make sure that everything is okay. And that's kind of annoying, but it's very important with user input. Now, the last thing I want to do is I'm going to put this where it should be, which is up here. And then let's make sure that no code after this runs. So I could put this within or after an else in the if statement. So if then and then else. However, most likely you're going to have a lot of code down here, not just this single line. So what we could put in the if statement is we'll keep the message box to tell you no range was entered, And then let's go ahead and exit the sub. I did a very similar thing with the message box tutorial, so part 1 of this one, where you exited the sub if the user hit the no button, I believe it was. And this is the same thing. So no code's going to run after this, after it tells you that no range was entered. So as you can see, it can get complicated really quickly, although this isn't too complicated, probably may look a little complex. But the main thing is you just always have to check everything a user is going to input because you're going to be doing something with what the user inputs. Here, I just used it as a simple range to input a value, but you could be selecting multiple worksheets, or later on I'll show you how to select different workbooks, and you want to make sure that what is actually brought into your macro via user input is not going to blow it up, basically. Now I could spend hours going over every single example for get user input validation, but I'm not going to do that. I gave you 2 very useful cases for using application.inputBox, and what I'm going to do here, also I showed you 2 different ways to actually use this down here is, let's tidy this up. I'm going to add some comments for you guys. Put hi into the user selected cell. Check if a range was, let's say, input. Ignore any errors in the macro. Now remember, this is dangerous. If you're going to do this, you need to know the issues that it can cause. And in this case, it's a very simple macro, and we have a very simple issue, and we are taking care of that very simple issue right down here. And this gets the user input. In this case, it is a range. Now what I want to do up here is to paste in the options for the type argument. So down here all the way to the right, type. You can see we have an options for formula, number, text or string, true, false, range reference, error value, and array of values. I'm not going to cover all those here. Here I just covered some very simple and useful ones, the formula and the range reference, which I think is so useful and so nice to use with the application.inputBox. But also useful could be text and string. It's probably the next most useful one, and then formula and true, false. Now you are going to have to do a little bit of validation if you do some of these, such as the formula, and so that's why I'm not going to cover that here. But this should give you an idea of what you can do with this input box. Once you go beyond this, actually most likely once you go beyond text, string, and number and range reference, you want to use a user form, which will be covered in a completely different set of tutorials actually. But now you know how to use the application.inputBox right here. And then up here, we've got the what's called the InputBox function. So if you see someone talk about InputBox function online, they're talking about this one that does not have the application dot in front of it. Now I know that was a lot of stuff to cover, and I hope you're able to stick with me through it. Make sure that you download the sample file, and remember that the sample file for this one is also going to at the top include everything for the message box. So the message box file might not have everything for the user input, but this one will have everything for the message box since these tutorials just followed one another. So that's it for this tutorial, and I hope you learned a lot. I hope you liked the tutorial. If it was helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials.